I'm David Adams, and I want you to come with me on an epic journey.
I'm fascinated by the rise of empires and the bitter, bloody dynastic struggles that tore them apart. Timur, the sword of Islam. Edgar, king of all the English. Attila the Hun, and Charlemagne, the father of Europe. All built vast empires that dominated our world before they fell, destroyed from within by vicious family infighting.
In 8th century Europe, an all-conquering king shows no mercy to a pagan culture.
He tracks down his enemy's most sacred icon. He orders it to be chopped down.
He leads his army to new heights.
Climbing these is an enormous undertaking, and he did it 2 passes with 2 armies.
But then his successor is removed from the throne.
Louis is effectively imprisoned here in a monk's cell.
The final outcome is bloodshed, betrayal, and the end of empire.
Over 1,000 years ago, one man creates an empire that spans nearly all of Europe. At a time when life across the continent is fragmented and chaotic, he has a vision on a grand scale and the charisma and the drive to make it a reality.
And that man was Charlemagne, Charles the Great.
Out of the barbarian tribes that replaced the Roman Empire, he forges a new Christian realm and keeps adding to it, conquering new territories in all directions.
Now, 1,000 years after Hannibal had crossed the Alps to invade Italy, Charlemagne was about to do the same.
Daring tactics, brilliant leadership, and sheer force of numbers make Charlemagne and his army the most feared military power in 8th century Europe.
Charlemagne is relentless, waging over 50 campaigns during a 45-year reign. As new territories are swallowed up, he puts his leadership skills to other uses, uniting a growing empire of divided peoples. He introduces laws that uphold justice, a new currency that sees trade flourish and champions education for all. But most importantly, Charlemagne's Catholic faith binds his people together under the same God. By the end of his reign in 814, Charlemagne commands a single Christian empire that spans more than 1 million square kilometers. It's the foundation of modern Europe.
Charlemagne's grand ambitions die with him. His sons and grandsons will wage a vicious family war that shatters the empire forever.
But Charlemagne's many achievements would never have been possible without the rise to prominence of his own people, the Franks.
And some of the most powerful reminders of their influence are here at Saint Denis Cathedral in Paris. It's the last resting place of 42 kings, including the Frankish rulers that many consider the founders of the French monarchy. But just 3 centuries before Charlemagne's birth, the Franks were an obscure Germanic tribe, that had migrated to the northern fringes of the Roman Empire. Historian Rosamund McKitterick is one of the leading experts on how the Franks thrive in the vacuum left behind when that empire falls.
What you have after the last Roman emperor is deposed in the 5th century is a series of smaller kingdoms in what we would now call Spain, France, Italy, and the like. Very political world. It has to do with maneuvering, territorial strength, there's an assertion of authority, who is regarded as the top person.
The Franks form an alliance with the one pillar of the Western Roman Empire that remains, the Christian Church.
But this is now very much a Christian world.
That's absolutely right. The kingdoms are all Christian. The Pope is, in a way, establishing his own kind of kingdom in Rome as the effective ruler.
But without an army, the Pope is vulnerable. To protect the Church's territories and its spiritual message, he needs military muscle, and the Franks are happy to provide it. In 732, Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, is the general who saves Christian Europe when he defeats an invading Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in central France. His victory cements the influence of the Franks, but also that of his family over the existing royal dynasty. One generation later, Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, seizes the throne with the backing of the Pope, who crowns him here in Saint-Denis. He's the first of the Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne is 6 years old and a joint heir with his brother Carloman. But when their father dies, the succession is far from smooth.
So essentially what you have is the kingdom is going to be divided between the two of them until Carloman decides that he's not going to cooperate with his brother. There's some kind of falling out.
Faced with this power struggle, their mother Bertrada mediates between her two quarreling sons. Eventually, though, Bertrada chooses sides. She travels to Brescia in northern Italy, the capital of a people called the Lombards, to secure a political alliance that will strengthen her eldest son, Charlemagne.
Bertrada arranges a marriage with the daughter of the king of the Lombards. But the problem is, the Pope is completely against this union. The last thing he wants in the world is for the Franks and the Lombards to be aligned.
The Pope and the Lombards have a long and turbulent history. For 2 centuries, the Lombards have been the Pope's biggest threat, almost seizing Rome just a few years earlier. The Lombard kingdom stretches from the Alps down into the heart of Italy, but they also lay claim to the Pope's territories. With Charlemagne's proposed marriage, the Pope sees the danger of losing his biggest ally to his arch-enemy. The Pope warns the young king of the foul and stinking Lombards and the sinful nature of an unjust coupling with an alien race. And his words seem to have the desired effect. According to one 9th century source, Charlemagne rejects his soon-to-be bride, and she's sent back to Brescia in disgrace.
It's the ultimate insult, and he's made a lifelong enemy of Desiderius, the king of the Lombards.
But as one threat grows, another disappears. In 771, Carloman dies, suddenly and inexplicably, aged just 20. Charlemagne has lost not just a brother, but a rival too. The path is now clear for Charlemagne to become sole ruler of the Franks. But he's already setting his sights beyond his own kingdom. He gets his chance 2 years later, when the Lombards invade papal territories near Rome, and the Pope sends out a plea for help. Charlemagne plans an audacious military mission, a high-risk, high-altitude attack across the Alps and into northern Italy to take on his enemy. Charlemagne mobilizes an army of around 40,000 men, but getting them safely across a series of exhausting mountain passes and into Lombard territory is a massive logistical challenge. To complicate matters, many are heavily equipped mounted troops, wearing the sort of armor that Peter Muller still specializes in making. An account from the time describes Charlemagne at the head of his army as the Iron Man, covered head to toe in armor, with a lance in one hand and his sword in the other.
So in Charlemagne's time, what was the armor defending against? What was the main weaponry of the period?
Lances and also arrows. On horse, they also fought by swords. They had as mainly body armor, some scale armors and mail.
I know this is from a different period, but I guess it's the same principle.
Yes, it is. If you look how it covers the brim here, it really protects against any kind of arrows or stuff that is coming down over here. Protects the shoulders as well as part of the breast.
Yeah. If you think of the size of these armies of 20,000, 30,000 men, there must have been a whole industry making armor for them.
Yeah, from the medieval times, it is known that a smaller workshop could even make up to 90 breastplates in a week.
Charlemagne's army is one of the biggest since Roman times, and he's about to take it on a punishing Alpine expedition. 1,000 years earlier, the Carthaginian general Hannibal and his men had taken a similar route. Half of them had died.
Now these passes range up from 2,600 meters right up to 3,600. Climbing these summer or winter is an enormous undertaking, and he did it in 2 passes with 2 armies.
Splitting up his army gives Charlemagne a 2-pronged attack into Italy. This challenge plays to his greatest strengths. Charlemagne is a supreme organizer and planner, and he needs to be.
For us up here, it's not very hard to bring up a burner, boil some water, and make some food. But for Charlemagne, crossing the Alps was an incredible undertaking. They had a whole baggage train following them. Thousands of people. Food had to be prepared every night. They would have set up tents, and they would have had to endure the elements. And that they could have been socked in here for days or weeks. Today, it's a lot easier and probably a lot more fun.
Charlemagne sends a unit of elite troops to outflank the Lombards waiting on the other side of the Alps. When their king realizes he's about to be attacked from the front and the rear, he retreats. Charlemagne and his army enter Italy unopposed. The Lombard king, Desiderius, escapes to his stronghold in Pavia, and Charlemagne surrounds the city. But Pavia's formidable defences keep the Frankish forces at bay. And with victory over a bitter enemy at stake, Charlemagne must find a way to break the Lombards' resistance. In late 8th century Europe, Charlemagne becomes king of the Franks. A devout Christian, he forms an alliance with the Pope. And as he conquers new nations, he spreads the word of God. When his enemies, the Lombards, invade the Pope's territories, Charlemagne marches his army into their heartland in northern Italy to stop them. The Lombard king retreats to his capital, Pavia, and its defences hold off Charlemagne and his 40,000-strong army.
Today, very little remains of the fortifications from the siege of 774. These watchtowers are actually from the 12th century, and then there was about 100 of them helping to defend the city.
In the time of Charlemagne, the Lombard king watches as the Franks begin to lay siege to his capital. Surprised at the size of the enemy forces, he reportedly says to an advisor, "Let us hide in the earth in the face of the fury of an enemy so terrible." As the siege drags on, life inside the city becomes increasingly desperate. This fresco tells an unusual version of how events unfold.
Well, it's often said that history is written by the victors. Well, in the case of this fresco, it was painted by the losers. It's the story of Teodoro, the Bishop of Pavia, who's defending the city single-handedly. Then arrows are fired by Charlemagne's nephew, and the bishop manages to turn the arrow around and kill the nephew. This last panel shows Charlemagne praying for the bishop to bring him back to life, which, in the end, at the top of that painting, he does. But that is not quite the truth of what happened. Charlemagne besieges the city for 10 months, and in the end, the people are starving.
Desiderius, the king of the Lombards, has no choice but to surrender to save his people and his soldiers.
Charlemagne sends him into exile, where 12 years later, he dies.
Charlemagne crowns himself the new king of the Lombards, an important step towards founding an empire. It goes beyond just seizing territory. Charlemagne is adding a new title to his name and establishing his right to rule over a people other than the Franks.
Charlemagne's power is based on the belief amongst his people that he's a righteous king chosen by God. And it's this power that he wants to pass on to his sons.
As his empire grows, so does Charlemagne's family. He has 4 wives and 11 children. And in exchange for Charlemagne's unwavering support, the Pope turns a blind eye to his many mistresses and illegitimate children. Charlemagne starts planning for the succession, preparing his sons by taking them on military campaigns and appointing them at a young age as rulers of regions in his empire. With heirs in place, the future of the empire looks secure. But a spiritual threat lies beyond its eastern borders. The Saxons are the last of the Germanic tribes to resist Christianity, holding on defiantly to their pagan religious beliefs. When they burn down a church in Frankish territory, Charlemagne declares a holy war. It turns into the most bitter and drawn out of his military campaigns, lasting over 30 years.
Charlemagne believes it's his religious duty to convert the Saxons and stamp out their beliefs. They worship many pagan gods and sacrifice animals in their honor. They cremate their dead and believe that nature is full of supernatural beings. Now, Charlemagne can't risk these practices spreading into his Christian empire. He tracks down his enemy's most sacred icon, the Irminsul, an enormous tree worshipped by the Saxons. He orders it to be chopped down. A decade later, a peace treaty looks like finally ending the conflict. But then the Saxons rebel, killing some of Charlemagne's men. His retribution is brutal. Charlemagne beheads 4,500 Saxons in a single day and secures victory. But as he destroys one culture, Charlemagne is intent on reviving another.
3 centuries earlier, the infrastructure that had kept the Roman Empire running had ground to a halt. Its tax-gathering system had collapsed, major trade routes had dried up, and buildings had fallen into disrepair. Now Charlemagne introduces measures that once again make it possible to run a huge empire and unite the different peoples within its borders.
1,200 years before the formation of the European Union, Charlemagne institutes a system of weights and measures
so that people can trade with confidence.
He brings in a new monetary system and standardizes manuscripts so they can be read throughout the whole empire.
It really is a united Europe under Charlemagne.
A great admirer of classical Roman culture, Charlemagne promotes the arts, from architecture to literature and sculpture. The cultural movement he oversees becomes known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He hires the leading tutors from across Europe to teach his children, and he dedicates himself to learning everything from mathematics and philosophy to astronomy. And Charlemagne wants everyone, rich or poor, to receive an education from the church. He introduces a 10% tax on goods to go towards an ambitious building program that results in new cathedrals and hundreds of monasteries where monks can run this new education system. But this flourishing cultural movement is financed by conquest and victory on the battlefield. And when it comes to seizing new territory, he lets nothing get in the way, including his own family.
In 788, he decides to annex Bavaria, the territory of his cousin Tassilo. And on a series of trumped-up charges, he has him convicted of treason.
Charlemagne accuses his cousin of conspiring against him with the Avars, a fierce nomadic people. Their territory stretches from the borders of Germany all the way to Serbia. Having taken Bavaria from his cousin, Charlemagne now uses it to launch a series of attacks against the Avars. He dealt successfully with the Lombards, but now Charlemagne faces a more ferocious threat. His new enemies are deadly mounted warriors, descendants of Atila the Hun. And they gather on the Bavarian border, ready to retaliate with a raid on Frankish lands.
Crossing the Danube in search of plunder, the Avars hit Lombardy in northern Italy.
And then they invade Bavaria, where they come up against Charlemagne's army, who stops them dead in their tracks. Thousands die in the battlefield, and thousands more are drowned in the Danube when they flee back across the border.
But that's not the end of these Hun descendants. In 791, Charlemagne raises the stakes and launches a series of campaigns deep into Avar territory in Hungary, striking at his enemy's greatest stronghold. With him are two of his sons, Pepin and Louis, and eventually they come face to face with one of the Middle Ages' most infamous fortifications, the Avar Rings.
They actually had a series of 9 concentric circles, one inside the other. Now, they were made of timber, stone, and also mud, but then on the top of them, they planted trees.
The outermost ring encircled a vast area, while the innermost one protected a single fortress.
It was an incredible barrier for the army of Charlemagne to try and get through.
After a grueling campaign, it's Charlemagne's eldest son, Pepin, who finally breaches the Great Ring Fortress and secures the surrender of the Avars. According to one account, Pepin finds a vast treasure amassed by past kings over many centuries. He returns home to his father, a hero, and Charlemagne distributes these riches across the empire, enough to finance it for 2 decades. After surrendering, the Avar rulers convert to Christianity, and the borders of Charlemagne's empire stretch even further east. He now rules all of Western and Central Europe, from the Atlantic to the Hungarian steppe. The town of Aachen in today's Germany becomes Charlemagne's base. And he transforms it by building a palace and a magnificent chapel.
Charlemagne's court would have been full of aristocrats, scholars and merchants. But there were also common folk, and there were even beggars and prostitutes. It would have been an amazing sight, all those people here.
From across the world, leaders come to pay their respects. To secure Charlemagne's friendship, the Caliph of Baghdad even sends a war elephant.
Now, these doors are actually the original doors. They're 1,200 years old, and they're made of bronze. They weigh about 2.5 tons. Now, can you imagine all of those people filing in here to celebrate Charlemagne?
On Christmas Day 800, Pope Louis III crowns Charlemagne emperor of a new Christian empire. Those attending shout out, "Long life and victory to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peaceful emperor of the Romans." He's the first emperor in Western Europe in over 300 years. And his empire has a newfound religious legitimacy. He's never been more powerful. But Charlemagne is in his late 50s, and the need to secure his succession is urgent. He has 3 potential heirs in the running to take control. But it won't be long before family politics puts the future of the empire at risk.
When families do battle over the throne, the end result can be the end of empire. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, builds a flourishing empire at the turn of the 9th century. He's crowned Emperor of the Romans, uniting continental Europe under one ruler and one God. The new Holy Roman Emperor has been king of the Franks for almost 30 years. And over that time, he's waged almost ceaseless military campaigns. He's 58 years old, and now his attention turns to choosing a successor. It's a decision that could spell trouble. According to Frankish custom, a kingdom wasn't inherited by the oldest son. Instead, it was divided up between all the male heirs. This practice had destabilized the Frankish world for centuries, fracturing territories, sapping power, and sparking bitter family feuds.
But Charlemagne keeps with tradition and makes plans to divide the empire between his 3 heirs, Charles, Louis, and Pepin. Then in 810, tragedy strikes. Pepin dies, followed just months later by his brother Charles.
With only one surviving legitimate heir, Charlemagne's succession plans have been decided for him. The empire will pass to 35-year-old Louis the Pious. And in 813, Charlemagne himself crowns his son joint emperor.
With the future of the empire set, Charlemagne celebrates with a hunting trip, his passion since childhood. Charlemagne had spent a lifetime mastering falconry and believed all nobles should learn it. Falconer Michael Palko is an expert in the art's regal history.
Why is it that they're so associated with royalty?
The social status also at the times, yeah. And when you look at the bird of prey, they also look so noble.
Yeah.
Each person was not allowed to hunt with each kind of bird. Yeah? It was strict rules who...
So the hierarchy depended on which bird you used, and wow.
Like a farmers was allowed to fly with a goshawk. Monks was using the sparrowhawks, and only the royals was able to fly the sacred falcons.
Mm-hmm. Once they catch them, then they would be eating them at the dinner that night, I guess, would they?
Yeah, you have to always reward them. So it's always the sharing the prey with the bird of prey.
This hunt is Charlemagne's last. He catches pneumonia and dies at his palace in Aachen a few months later. Far and wide, people mourn the loss of the emperor. A great military leader, educator, and political visionary.
Charlemagne's body is laid in a beautiful 3rd century Roman sarcophagus. And there his body remains until 1165, when he is made a saint.
Different kings commissioned the making of these relics many years after Charlemagne's death. All of them contain one of the great ruler's bones.
The rest of the body is put into the golden shrine that lies in Aachen Cathedral.
Just as Charlemagne had used the order of the Roman Empire to enhance his own standing, so, centuries later, rulers used these relics to associate themselves with Charlemagne and add to their prestige.
Well, this is the imperial throne. Now, since Charlemagne's time, 31 emperors and kings have been crowned right here. And at the age of 36, Louis climbs these steps and takes the throne. But he's no Charlemagne.
His rule will be plagued by unrest. Louis will lose and then struggle to regain the empire in a clash with power-hungry family rivals. But when he first emerges from his father's shadow, Louis shows some of the same qualities. He's an excellent general and capable administrator. In other ways, though, Louis strikes a more divisive tone. At Charlemagne's court, prostitutes and beggars had become a common sight. But Louis, a very zealous Christian, puts an end to such tolerance with a program of strict moral reform. He removes all women, including his sisters, from the palace at Aachen. Illegitimate children, including his own half-brothers, are banished too. Unsettling the royal court creates powerful enemies. And Louis is already struggling with an issue that threatens his authority: the succession. A quarrel is escalating between his sons over their roles within the empire.
In 817, Louis names his eldest son, Lothar, as his successor and co-emperor. And he grants him an enormous kingdom, which includes Italy.
His 2 younger sons and a nephew, Bernard, are not happy with their share of the territories. Bernard, who rules over a kingdom in Italy, rebels against his uncle. And Louis has him tried for treason.
He's convicted, and his eyes are burned out with a red-hot poker. After 2 days in absolute agony, Bernard dies, and Louis is consumed with guilt.
Dressed in rags and covered in ashes, Emperor Louis performs an act of penance. While some are impressed by his devoutness, to others, his public apology is a sign of weakness, and it further undermines his support. Then in 823, the question of the succession becomes even more troubled. Louis's second wife gives birth to a son, Charles. In keeping with Frankish tradition, plans are made to divide up the empire again, so Charles can also inherit his share. The sons ignore their father's decision, and the emperor retaliates by stripping them of their titles and territories. This enrages Louis's older sons and sparks a civil war. The sons detain their father and place him and their half-brother Charles under house arrest at Saint-Denis in Paris. Soon after, the oldest brother Lothar declares himself sole ruler of the empire.
Louis is effectively imprisoned here in a monk's cell. Now his fate lies with the monks here at Saint-Denis. If he can't convince them to shift their allegiance back to him, well, he could well spend the rest of his life here in a cloistered cell.
But Louis manages to win over the monks guarding him. They help send a message to the two younger rebel sons, Pepin and Louis, promising an increase in the share of the empire if they set their father free. The plan works. Louis is released and regains control. But the family power struggle drags on. Eventually, Louis meets up with his warring sons, hoping to make peace once and for all.
Well, this is Colmar in the Alsace. The German border's just a few k's away from here. Now, in 833, Louis the Pious came to a field just out of town to face his three sons and their armies. He thought he was coming here to negotiate, to try and heal the family rift.
Instead, the brothers call on their father to give up the empire and abdicate. He refuses, and fighting looks like it's about to erupt between the rival forces. The standoff lasts for days, but Louis's supporters begin to question their allegiance. According to one account, they are partly drawn away by bribes, partly enticed by promises, and partly terrified by threats.
Overnight, almost all of Louis's supporters cross over to the sons, and Louis has no choice but to abdicate.
The site of this confrontation becomes known as the Field of Lies, and this betrayal further weakens the empire's chances of survival.
Mighty empires are often brought down from within in brutal dynastic struggles. In 8th century Europe, Emperor Charlemagne forges a great empire, but his successor, Louis the Pious, is deposed by his own sons, leaving the future of the empire in doubt.
Well, Louis is stripped of his imperial title and his nobility. He's imprisoned here in the Abbey of Saint Médard in Soissons in France.
And it's within these walls that the emperor suffers further humiliation. He's forced to perform an act of penance in front of church leaders and nobles.
Louis is made to confess that he'd broken his vows to God, but then his son Lothar presses him even further, insisting that he remain a monk for life. Now, this doesn't eventuate, but it greatly weakens the idea and the power of the imperial throne.
The title of emperor has been tarnished and its authority diminished. But Louis has also been degraded, and many think that Lothar's treatment of his father has gone too far. His supporters turn against him, and Louis is allowed to go back to the imperial palace in Aachen.
Louis returns to power. He rules for another 5 years, but his authority is greatly weakened.
He outlives one of his sons, Pepin, but his surviving 3 heirs continue their quarrel over the succession.
But infighting within the empire has not gone unnoticed. Louis is forced to defend the empire's northern borders from Viking raiders who are carrying out a series of terrifying attacks. At the age of 62, Louis catches a fever and dies. With his last breath, it's said that he forgives his sons and prays that they will finally live in peace. But that prayer will go unanswered.
After the death of Louis, great efforts are made to try and broker a peace between the three brothers.
But the sides are just too far apart.
Across Europe, barons and noblemen choose who to throw their support behind. The feud of the imperial throne is about to reach a brutal conclusion.
In 841, outside the small village of Fontenoy in France, the two sides come together. Accounts say that as many as 300,000 men faced each other on the battlefield. It was a family brawl on an unimaginable scale.
Lothar's army faces off against those of his younger brothers. Wielding throwing axes and stabbing swords, the armies slaughter each other. The bloodiest battle of the 9th century is all over in a matter of hours. Some 40,000 corpses lie in the fields. Despite his own bravery on the battlefield, Lothar's forces collapse. As he retreats, he loots the imperial palace in Aachen and scours the area for supporters to help him renew his attack.
The strict Christian ideals of Louis and Charlemagne's rallying cry that connects winning wars to a loyalty to God is a distant memory. The Carolingian Empire has lost its moral compass.
Eventually, Lothar sues for peace, and the brothers draw up a treaty that puts an end to the War of Succession.
That treaty divides Europe between the three brothers equally. It's the end of Charlemagne's empire.
But it's also the dawn of the Europe we know today. The territory Charlemagne had worked so hard to unite will split again along political lines. The new Western Kingdom will eventually become France, and to the east, Germany will emerge. But Middle Francia never becomes a recognizable country. With long borders vulnerable to invasion and a mix of cultures that prove difficult to unite, it collapses, leaving its identity unresolved and disputed. Over the next 1,000 years, more blood is spilt on this strip of land than anywhere else in Europe, as France and Germany fight and refight wars for its control. Within 4 decades of his death, Charlemagne's united empire has given way to shifting borders and constant conflict. But the reforms he championed in education, justice, and the arts gave rise to a European identity, one that transcended borders and survives to this day.